Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to start with some questions about how you've set the ground rules for founder dynamics in your companies. How have you thought about ground rules? Maybe, JJ, you'd like to start as you're in the hot seat.
Sure. So when my co-founder and I started the company, this is our first company, so there are many things across every skill set that neither of us had done before. The most important thing was not even figuring out which piece each of us was an expert in, but just having very clearly defined ground rules. So knowing who was going to manage tech, HR, accounting, that was by far the most important thing. And then even as we've grown from 2 people to 70 employees today, having very clear, strict guidelines about who owned what was always the thing that helped us keep everything at bay. You knew who was the final decider.
Okay, yeah, Kirk.
So for us, we started the company in 2010. My co-founder actually left the day-to-day operations in 2015. And so we had a long journey both together and now with James just on the board. I think some of the important lessons that we learned along the way, one of the rules we made after a couple of years was that startups are hard and there are lots of battles to be fighting outside, and we shouldn't be fighting any battles inside. That was a hard thing based on the question of do you want your employees to be able to see that sort of the tough conversations that you're having, or do you want them to happen sort of behind closed doors? We did both and found that it was much better when we kept those to be candid conversations between us and had a really united front sort of looking outward to the organization. And I think that was the biggest thing that we learned along the way.
So one of the follow-up questions that I'm going to ask, and because you raised it, I'll cover it now, is about the equity between co-founders. So there were 2 of you.
Yeah.
Did you split it 50-50 or did you do something different?
So we did something different based on James had more money to put into the company to bootstrap it at the beginning than I did. And so we sort of looked at it and said, okay, part of it is, we'll do it 50-50 as it relates to equity in the company based on, we were both going to work hard and we were both going to take equal roles in the company. But then we split up additional shares for him based on the equity that he was, or the dollars that he was putting into the company.
Okay, and you've now done 1.6 times as much work as him, right? But 8 years rather than 5 years. How have you taken account of that?
That's a great question. You're going right to the heart of things, like right off the bat. So, we had initial vesting when we first took on VC financing. That was a interesting pill to swallow when we first did the A round. The VC came in and said, okay, we need to put some vesting on the shares. And we're kind of like, well, we've already got the shares. Why are we now vesting them? He left after all of his shares were vested, and I was fine with that. And then since that time, we've done ESOP top-ups for many of the executives, me included, and that's how we deal with it moving forward.
Okay, sounds good. And Adam, in terms of ground rules and what you've learned along the way?
Well, honestly, we never really set any ground rules. We're still a young company, over 10 people. I actually know my co-founder for quite many years, both from a personal side of things. So we never had any particular ground rules that have been set. That being said, things sort of naturally move. He's more on the technical side, I'm on the business side. So we sort of had natural ground rules more than anything else. But the importance of having a good relationship with a co-founder, I've had great experiences and less great experiences. I think the best quote I ever heard on this was that co-founders are basically like getting married, but without the sex. So, I mean, the bottom line is that you need to solve your problems, and it's hard, but you have to have a good relationship, because I totally agree with this. I don't remember who said it beforehand, that the co-founder will make or break the company, especially at the early stage.
Interesting that it's 2 for all of you, 2 co-founders.
Actually, we're 3.
Oh, you're 3?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. And did you split the equity equally 3 ways?
Prefer not to comment on that, but but it's not exactly equal. We actually What we actually found was the bringing in, we actually ended up, initially it was the two of us, but we brought in a third person, especially bringing in an early superstar as a founding team can be very beneficial.
And did you think about it in a similar way to Kirk at the start, that there's, you know, some equity for the work, and in Kirk's case, some equity for the money? Sometimes people say there's some equity for the intellectual property that gets brought, or for the, you know, for the inspiration to create the business as well.
From that side of things, I mean, we did have put in some cash, and the cash was a separate bucket. I mean, it was pretty simple, the separation. I mean, there's a separation between the work you do as well as the cash that you put in. That's a pretty easy breakdown. That's the money in the bank versus the sweat equity.
Okay, good. And JJ, how did you kind of cover the equity split amongst founders?
We've treated everything as an equal partnership from the beginning.
Okay, great. And when you set up the relationships, did you think of a kind of outside person, an inside person? Because sometimes, you know, often there'll be a founder who's the front person, and they're in the public eye. They get the kind of, they get the Bezos or whatever glory or let's say the Bill Gates glory rather than his co-founders when the business gets on. How did you think about that, and who wanted to grab and who was happy to relinquish that role?
First, the way we think about anything related to press and PR is always about helping the business. So for our business, we have two types of press. We help students and recent grads find jobs. So on the candidate side, we need to get in the press that students and candidates will read. But on the employer side, which is where the more mainstream type PR helps us most, it's sales. And since my co-founder has long run the sales team and is involved with sales, especially at a high enterprise level, it's always made sense for her to be the one more in the public eye. Because if we're in something like HR Review or Adweek or even the New York Times, if enterprises are seeing it, she's the right person to contact.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, I think we just figured out along the way where our natural skill set sort of drove us, and James was more on the technical side, and I was more on the storytelling side. And so both internally and externally, we found that I would take on that sort of role, that sort of customer-facing or PR-facing or investor-facing role, and James would work more internally. So I think it was really based on skill set and us figuring it out over time in terms of which one worked the best.
Yeah, similar to that, we had the natural separation from a skill set. We have a strong technical person. I'm more on the outside facing. That being said, we back each other up. So if we have for example, we have an interview or we have a session with the press, I think you actually raised the point, I think, in terms of glory. You can't ever be thinking about glory or who's in the news or whatever. I mean, I think taking egos out of the equation, where I've seen startups go wrong is when the egos get in the way and people with glory or equity or whatever, you need to check your egos at the door to be successful, because if you have people, worrying about those types of things, there's far more bigger problems than that type of stuff.
That's the right answer.
Yeah.
So, Kirk, you spoke a little bit about arguments, keeping them in the family or showing them, letting them be seen by other employees. In the early days, you're pretty tightly packed together. How JJ and Adam, have you managed disputes when you and your co-founders have been not seen eye to eye? Has that been apparent to employees, or have you managed to keep it inside, completely behind closed doors, so that you present a united front? And what's better? What's healthier?
Yeah, that's a great question. So like he was saying, co-foundership is like a marriage, and in a marriage, you generally don't want to fight in front of the kids. I think it's very much the same thing. But there's a very big difference between not fighting and disagreeing. So we wouldn't fight. Like, there would never be a time when, or there shouldn't be a time when in front of employees, we'd be rude to each other or argue in a way that was unhealthy. But it's very different than being in a meeting and having different points of view on the same thing. So it's a combination of having a healthy culture of disagreement And then, like I said at the beginning, if you have clear boundaries about who owns what at the end of the day, if you strongly disagree and no one's budging, there's always one person who at the end of the day owns that domain. So you can make a decision.
Yeah, I think I have a different opinion in that, and I think that actually having those disagreements in public is not a bad thing as long as you keep it respectful and keep it, keep it a respectful. Even having the team. So my co-founder, he comes from Amazon, where the famous commitment, the famous words of Jeff Bezos are disagree and commit. So it's okay to disagree, but you need to move forward with that disagreement and come to a resolution, then disagree and commit. So there's been, in Amazon has a lot of famous statements about that, where Bezos would say, listen, I don't agree with it, I disagree, but we're going to commit to doing this, and then moving forward. The problems that you have in startups and even big companies is if you disagree and then people are grumbling along the way, and then that's a disaster. So you can disagree and then commit to move forward.
Okay, good. So let's move on and talk about hired hands. When you're bringing outsiders into the company in senior positions, maybe at the VP level, maybe a VP sales that gets paid a lot of money, probably more than you guys. Maybe a CEO that gets more if you bring in a third-party CEO. I don't know if any of you have done that in your current companies or previously. How do you think about those challenges? Back to the hot seat.
And we just hired a big portion of our exec team, so VP sales, CMO, VP product, VP engineering. In terms of how we think about it, it was to build the best company we can. We wanted to have people who really deeply knew what they were doing. So we went out and found those people who were cultural fits. I don't think from a co-founder perspective there was much to talk about in that regard, because we wanted people who complemented both of us.
Are they paid more than you?
Most of them.
Okay. Any issues from that?
No.
Okay, another right answer.
Yeah. I mean, this is our baby. So from the beginning, when we got paid nothing, to now, every dollar that I make in salary to me is taking away from the lifeblood of the company. Obviously, I need a salary to live, but I'd rather save that money for execs who can make the company huge than for me.
Okay.
Yeah, so tough question. We've hired a lot of senior people in the organization. We're closing in on 200 people at Wave. And I think one of the things that we've been working on over the last little while is bringing in a larger set of diverse individuals. I think the natural tendency in the early days is to hire people that look and feel and think like you do. And I think the benefit that we're experiencing now with a much larger employee count is how do we hire people that think very, very differently than we do, often through that process look very differently than we do, and how do we get rid of some of our own biases when we're interviewing and speaking with those candidates in order to find the right people. And I would tell you it's sometimes a struggle. Our own biases are real and in a lot of ways locked in. And I think I've gone through a lot of soul searching over the last couple of years on how do I look for people who can really round out the team, and how do we set up our interviewing process such that we can hire those people and find those right people. So that's been an area of real focus for us over the last couple of years.
Yeah, you initially started about hired hands. I particularly don't like the statement of hired hands. I think the employees that we bring on board and executives, we want to treat them as our partners, as people that are brought on board. You know, they may not have been there from day one, but I don't think it matters much. I mean, they're part of the team. They are, as much of we want to include as many people as possible to be partners, to argue with us, to be part of the process. So I don't think it's I think sometimes we put in too much of a glamour of a founder, that I think that a lot of the great decisions and the great moves are being made from the quote unquote hired hands. And the more you empower these people, the better the company is. So I think that sometimes there's a little bit too much glorifying the founder, but some of the greatest things that we have done so far have not come from the founders. They've come from the team itself.
So that's a really interesting opening there, because people that you hire into the business are different in two ownership ways. So one is that they won't have founder equity, founder ownership, and the other one is that they won't have the emotional ownership that they have, that you have as founders. It's your baby with a founder business, but you really want them to act like you in having that sense of ownership. How do you do that? You don't want them to be hired hands, right? I mean,
Exactly.
You absolutely don't want them to act like that. You want them to act like they own the farm with you.
So I think a lot of it has nothing to do with shares or equity or for salaries or so on. It's the way that you treat the people and the way that you respect the people and the way that you disagree or agree with them. And it's about working and empowering people. I don't think it comes down to the numbers. I think it comes down to the way in which you work with people. Obviously, you want to, for someone who does a great job, you want to give them bonuses, you want to give them all that other kind of stuff. But I think it's the way you treat people is really the way in which that works.
So I'll give a specific example. We hired very early on a gentleman who's running all of our financial services products. And I think the best way to get that sort of buy-in that you're talking about is to truly be open to new ideas that people bring forward, to not be dogmatic about your own view of exactly what you thought the startup was going to look like, how it was going to operate, all those kinds of things. Are people truly going to have the influence to take the company in new directions? And I think when they feel that, empowerment's an overused word, but that level of empowerment or that level of trust from the founders, that you can get situations where, quite frankly, they're just as bought in as co-founders, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think executives are going to be motivated. They're intrinsically motivated and passionate, or they're not. And anyone who I could hire who would only be motivated by the equity position probably wouldn't work out in the long term. And even going back to the hired hands thing, it can't be that. The seed and the Series A, investors are betting on the founders. By the time you're raising a Series C, you're betting on the executive team.
Okay. And in what circumstances would you bring in an outside person as CEO of the business?
It's a great question. We haven't done that yet, so I don't know. I could answer that one.
Would you ever do it?
I honestly don't think I could answer that. I think it's one of those where, when I think about all the different executive roles, and this is one of the differences sometimes with a CEO versus other founding team members, you could start with a head of marketing, and then as the company grows, maybe eventually you need someone who is a specialist in marketing. The job of the CEO is to be a specialist in the company, and that one is very hard to replace, because who's going to know the company better than one of the people who founded it?
So my mantra is a little bit different. We've been around for 8 years, and through that time, we've had to make changes to management team when the situation arose. And so I take the very same view with the CEO role, which is if there's a better person to lead the company at that point in time, then that should be discussed. And I feel the same way about the entire management team, that people aren't on the ride automatically for the life of the company. The company is going to go through all sorts of changes, and I feel the same way. As I look in the mirror, I think to myself, am I the best person to lead the company at this particular time? And when and if I feel that the answer to that is no, then that's a conversation I want to be having.
Yeah, so I've done a few of these startups and both seen the role of the CEO and founder as well as bringing it outside. I totally agree with you that if there's someone that can do a much better job than all the more power to him or her. I think most of the companies I've seen been successful have had the founder as CEO, but I've seen companies been successful as outside CEOs. I don't think there's a magic formula. It just really depends on the circumstances in the company. But once again, I think that we would be doing ourselves as a disservice as founders and saying, no, the founder has to say the CEO.
Let's move on from magic to horror stories. And what's the worst founder-related horror story that you could tell us? And it may involve founders, it may involve those awful VCs, it may involve
I have all of them, but
whoever. So pick the one that'll entertain us most.
I think in a certain one company, I'm going backwards in history, not in my existing company, obviously, was learning that one of my co-founders could talk the talk but not walk the walk, and finding that out along the ride and figuring out how to inform your investors that that's exactly the case. So that's a pretty painful experience when you find out that I've had other experiences where money has disappeared, and that as well. So I've done a few of these things. So I've had some crazy.
Between realizing that your co-founder was, hot air, and telling your board and investors, how long did that take?
That took a few months because we took mitigating activities beforehand. So we actually hired somebody that could walk the walk before we informed the investors that we had somebody that couldn't walk the walk. So I think it's not about, we managed the circumstances before we gave the bad news.
Horror story, Kirk, please.
I don't really have any horror stories. I'm trying to think. I think there's two sides, right? There's the side where, let's face it, VCs come in, they're on the board, they don't know the business very well, they push out the founder, and oftentimes in early stage companies, it's really, really hard to find examples of many companies that do well after that point. Like the statistics are just terrible at the early stage of that, but let's face it, it happens all the time. And then on the flip side, I've heard many different stories. I don't remember all the details, nor do I want to go into them, but of founders just misbehaving, right? And taking advantage of the role that they're in, whether or not it's just, they're not working hard and they're just slacking off and pushing everything on the team, or everything from, affairs with coworkers and all that kind of stuff. I think both sides are equally bad.
I've been very blessed that me and my co-founder have a great relationship, so my horror stories are only other ones in the New York tech ecosystem that I've seen. But I think what they were saying is very correct, where it tends to be the smaller ones. If you're not going to have a good relationship, it'll usually manifest early, and then you're not going to last very long. So actually the story I look to for kind of my anti-inspiration for horror story is the Twitter founding story, where there was a lot of bad blood between a bunch of the founders as they moved from one product to the other.
Okay, good, thanks. Just to open things up, does anybody have any burning questions that you'd like to put to our panelists? No? Good. I think, yeah, please, Ori. Just for people who can't hear it, the question was, when a company reaches the stage in its evolution where its focus shifts from product development to scaling up commercially, what changes in founder and management relationships?
I would say that I don't actually think there's a point when you stop focusing on product, and it's an important distinction. Even once you found product market fit and then you're really growing, by the very nature of growing the company, growing your employees, growing your sales team, growing your customer base, to your point, everything changes. And often parts of your product and your process have to change along with it. So for us, as we've grown, when we started out as a much smaller company, we mainly sold to SMBs and mid-market. As we've grown a lot, more and more of our focus now is enterprise. So on the one hand, we've completely transformed the company with a real stronger focus on building a robust sales team. And more of our board conversations are around growing sales, whereas before it was product. On the other hand, we still focus plenty on product because we now need to build products that take our existing product and make it fit better for enterprise.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. First of all, that as I said, we're approaching 200 people, and the focus on product and engineering is always at the forefront of our mind. But I would say that my role, for instance, has changed a lot, where where I used to be much closer to the product cycles and much closer to the engineering initiatives and that kind of stuff. When I go home at the end of the week now, it's a different feeling that I have to get sort of energy from. It's much less about what individual project or product did I help move forward, and much more about how did I empower the management team to be more successful? How did we hire great people to sort of take us to the next level? It's much more about the team and much less about my sort of impact on the day-to-day of the product itself.
Yeah, so we're still at the early stage, but I have been involved in companies going to scale to $50, $100 million plus. I think just comes down to products and sales. I mean, whether you're a 10-person company or a 200-person company, I think in a company, the companies that have been less successful I've been involved with, either very simply in a company, you're either building something or selling something, and then it's pretty simple.
Great, thanks. I'm actually going to call time. I can see there's one more question, but please approach us individually so that we can keep to time today. So I'd like to thank our panelists. Really good talking with all of you, and thank you for listening.